Dr. Gibson from Arizona State University, who has been the principal investigator over his career for research and teaching interests that include front-end planning, organizational change, asset management, alternative dispute resolution, and risk management. He developed the Construction Industry Institute's Project Definition Rating Index, a decision support tool for use in front-end planning. He has been active on many national committees, among them several National Research Council, Department of Energy, and Architectural Engineering Institute. He is currently a board member on DOE's Project Leadership Institute, and in addition, Dr. Gibson is assisting DOE, incorporating current research and tools for front-end planning to help update our guide on Project Definition Rating Index, PDRI, and front-end planning over the next year. So with that, welcome Dr. Gibson.
Good afternoon. Wow, it's really loud. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk to a lot of project managers in the room, and so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've done over the last few years. I have a tendency to wander. That's why I've got the lavalier mic on, and I'm going to give you a presentation. I've got 45 minutes. I've got 58 slides. You're going, ooh. But it's kind of like the Burma shave billboards where it's like one thought on everything, always shave with Burma shave. If you've been to North Dakota, it's the wall drug thing, right? So I'm going to keep going with things as we go through here, and then hopefully we might have a little time for Q&A, but I'll be here through the no-host reception this afternoon as well. You may notice, and it's really difficult to follow Maria. That was a wonderful presentation. Really neat project program that they're doing in San Francisco. I'm going to tie some of the things I say into the presentations that were made this morning as well. I know with some of the things that Paul talked about, and also some of the things that Adam talked about. So we'll get to that in just a moment. One thing about me, I have a little different accent than some of the other speakers here. I'm originally from LA, Lower Alabama. So you'll get a chance to kind of hear through that as we go through this thing today. And so let's talk a little bit about the subject, and we're going to start a little game. It's called What If I Could, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about what if I could do this or that as a project manager, as a leader of a project team, as a leader looking at program management. What if I could do this? Well, I think the first one that I'll throw out here is, what if I could say between 6 and 25% on cost and 6 and 39% on schedule through effective front-end planning versus a baseline TPC. How many of you, does that sound pretty good? Yeah. Okay, so that's the result of over $100 billion worth of research focus on projects, not research projects, but focus on over $110 billion worth of projects. We've never found a situation since we've been doing this research where if you do good planning, you're going to have poor results than if you do poor planning. And so we've documented this over and over again. And I think we all probably understand this. Here's an example of a study we did in 2006, around $35 billion worth of projects. This does not include any DOE projects, but it does include a lot of commercial and governmental projects. And we found out that, and we could measure effective front-end planning versus less effective front-end planning, and we found that in terms of performance, those projects that were planned better cost 10% less versus baseline, statistically significant, 7% shorter delivery, and 5% fewer change orders, absolute value of change orders. And so we've been looking at this for a long time, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but what if you could do this? Well, the answer is you can. What if I could invest $1 in front-end planning and get $3 to $10 back? How many of you think that's a good investment? Probably most of us. It's a heck of a lot better than what you can do right now in the investment markets. And yet we've documented this over and over again. When you spend the time and the effort up front on a project, it's going to return back to you. And yet we as humans kind of find that hard to believe. Or at least we think it's right, but then we don't do it. And so what if? What if you could bring with you on every project, thousands of years of project management planning experience to your projects. And I always thought that would be really nice if we could do that. And so over the years, we've developed a series of tools and techniques that are available and commercially used where we've had input from literally thousands and thousands of years of experience that says these are the important things to worry about. And these are the ways that you can analyze your projects to make them come out better. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So let's talk a little bit about DOE, and just to kind of go back in time and maybe tie this into some things that were discussed this morning. And back in 2008, there was a root cause analysis done based on some project failures that had occurred. And number one issue out of 143 that were identified was DOE often does not complete front-end planning. And then you can see some of the issues down below that. So that's 2008. There was a corrective action plan document that was put out, and the number one answer is strengthen front-end planning. And again, if you read through some of the words underneath that, and this is quoted right out of the document, these are some of the things that we know must be done in the front-end planning process. Let's fast forward to 2011, February, and the closure report from that, if you'll look at the green, some of the findings were, number one, improvement in the front-end planning process by, and one of the things was incorporating the project definition rating index as one of the ways and one of the things that we did to try to help ensure that we do an effective job of front-end planning on capital projects. That's kind of nice. One of the things that happened around 2008 was the requirement that PDRI be used on all those projects that are $100 million and above. At least take a look at PDRI metrics at CD2. And one of the things Paul showed this morning was that we're at 93% of construction projects that are 91% above the 90% level within 110% of the TPC at CD2. Now, you can use statistics in a lot of ways. I'm not saying that PDRI is solely responsible for that, but it started to be used at the same time. And so we see there's been improvement, and part of that's just this idea that we're going to do more up front. And that's really where I want to get back to today, is talking about what's important from the perspective of front-end planning, and do it from a high level and then get into some of the details as we move forward in the process. Another little fact that's kind of interesting, and I've been working with Zach West, and he came up with this information. Right now, there are over 115 projects at DOE that are greater than 10 million that are pre-CD2. A lot of opportunity for good planning. But if you look at all of the projects that DOE has, you'll see that there are almost 12,000 capital improvements, 1,300 facilities improved, and about $18 billion spent in the last 10 years on smaller projects. How are your smaller projects going? Do you do an effective job of front-end planning on all of those? And so the question that you have to ask yourself, if we're spending $1.8 billion a year on smaller projects, infrastructure type projects, as you heard earlier when Adam talked, if we save 10% on those projects, that's quite a bit of money. And it's a lot of headaches that we stay away from. So it's interesting. There's a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot of room for opportunity on the side of doing a better job in the front end. When you start looking at DOE documentation, the guide and tools for the project definition rating index are dated. They don't align with current research and commercial best practices. And so one of the things we're doing is actually looking at those, and I'm working with DOE to do this so that we can make those align more closely with what's out there. We've actually developed some tools for smaller projects, I think, that would work very effectively in some of your small cap projects. So stepping back, what I would say is that this thing we call planning is definitely not new. Planning's been going on as long as we've had recorded history, and before that. In fact, we've written things about it. This is just one quote from history, 3,000 years ago, Sun Tzu, Art of War. Yeah, we've known planning has been important for a long, long time. And in fact, if you look at most cultures, and when they started recording their history, planning is something that's out there. The thing that's happened over the last 25, 30 years, though, is that we've really started to understand what that means in the context of major capital projects and smaller capital projects. And so I want to kind of give you some of those ideas as we work our way through there. So I've had the great privilege over the past 26 years, I know I look like I'm 29, but over the past 26 years, I've been the principal investigator on a series of projects funded by the Construction Industry Institute, the National Research Council's Federal Facility Council, from the Sloan Foundation, and a number of other sources, including private organizations, looking at this idea of front-end planning. So 26 years of looking at this, and some of you say, well, didn't you get it right the first time? And what I found was that we kind of understood it at the high level, and then we started understanding there are different nuances for different sectors and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we've learned in 26 years and do it in the context I think that'll help you out and at least give you some big ideas of what you should do. So back in 1993, we mapped the front-end planning process. It really was not out there in the literature very much. This has changed over time. I think we finalized it, as it looks now, about 2001. And it's a phase-gated process. We looked at literally hundreds of organizations and how they did that process. And here's the terminology that CII has. We have 3 phases of the front-end planning process, from feasibility to concept to detailed scope. Generally, the rule of thumb is the front-end planning process encompasses about 30% of the design effort hours expended on a capital project. Now, that's a big rule of thumb because we have lots of different kinds of capital projects in different sectors, but I would throw that one out there kind of as the rule. If you look at the Order 413 process map, pull this right out of here, generally what I would say is the front-end planning process encompasses all of those things up until we get to about CD2. Now, on some projects, CD2, I heard this morning, 90% design. Obviously, you lose the ability to influence in the front-end plan when you go beyond about 30% of the design effort. But many of the activities that we talk about on that front-end planning process occur from the initiation of the project all the way through CD1 and then approaching CD2. So that's where I'm going to be talking about today in this front-end planning process as we go through this. Obviously, and we don't like to see this, but if we actually change the baseline or change the scope significantly on a project, then we have to plan that as well. What we see sometimes is people forget about the planning when they make major changes. It's almost like a new project. And you have to look at that. So it's something to keep in mind. So one of the things that's been very, I'm going to wander over here so I can talk to this side a little bit. One of the things that's been very, I feel a lot of privilege at over the years is I've had a chance to really look at 3 different major sectors of our industry and the planning processes that go into those. The heavy industrial sector first, and that's really where we cut our teeth on some of this research, but then going into the building or commercial sector, and then in the infrastructure sector. And what I can tell you is that a lot of things that apply to heavy industrial apply to infrastructure and apply to buildings. And there are also some nuances that are different as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and kind of some of the big ideas that go into that. I say that we've had input from over 280 organizations in this research, but it's hard to count them because some companies are no longer in existence, some have merged, some have split. It's probably more now, around over 300 organizations, including Department of Energy and many of the federal agencies, but also many multinational companies in the commercial sector. So it's been interesting. I remember one story I'll give you is very early in this research back in 92, 93, 94, we wanted to look at the front-end planning processes of some of the major capital investors in the United States in the manufacturing sector. And so I signed non-disclosure agreements. They gave us their big process maps, very similar to the three-phase process, except they had a lot of detail around them. And I was sitting in a room with a number of graduate students, and we were studying these and trying to find out where the intersections were. And we started looking at things, and it was like, these are all the same. You know, the names are changed a little bit, but all these processes are kind of the same. And yet every one of those companies thought that they had a proprietary advantage on their competitors. And we had their competitors' processes in front of us. I've come to realize over the years that it was an interesting observation that I didn't really comprehend until maybe 10 years later. It's not the process necessarily, it's how you execute. It's the people and the execution that make the difference. And so as you start looking at companies over and over again, you start seeing the same things. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of the same things. We looked at, in a lot of detail, at $108 billion, over $108 billion now of projects, 1,250 projects, very detailed. How did they go? How did the front-end planning go? How did they perform versus their baseline? You know, interviewed people, talked to them about what their perspectives were and so on and so forth. My brain is just about filled up now with projects over the years, and it's kind of interesting, and I'm going to give you a few examples here, but what I want to do is I give you some of these examples, and I want you to put yourself in this. These are real people, real companies, real dollars, real consequences of decisions that were made. All right? Maybe career-ending decisions that were made in some cases. So this is an example project. This was a nuclear power plant project from a public utility. They needed to meet plant water's discharge standards from a regulation perspective. They tried to do the front-end planning in-house. They had an inexperienced team, poor definition, didn't have a lot of leadership. I mean, we talked to people at the company and we got all these inputs. High turnover rate of personnel. Their contractor, they and their contractor didn't work together very well. What do you think happened? Not very good, right? 300% budget overrun, and they went from a 30-month schedule to a 60-month schedule. Right? That's a real project. Those are real people. And we keep seeing this in a lot of cases. Here's another one. Government project, institutional facility, one of your sister organizations, DOE, about $50 million baseline project. They had poor alignment amongst the tenants and amongst the project team. They didn't do a very good job of front-end planning. They had an inexperienced architect. That was one of the key factors. They didn't do very much constructability on the project, which came back to haunt them. They had a 90% schedule slippage, and they were 20% over baseline, and schedule was the key driver on the project. Again, real people, real dollars, real schedule. You kind of see this over and over again. Here's one more example. This is actually sort of a success. $50 million expansion to the petrochem facility. It was a copy of another existing facility. Baseline was about $50 million with a private owner. They had some early missteps. They really didn't have the right people in place. Then they put together a good team. They had a strong leader. They actually used the Project Definition Rating Index to do 2 evaluations with an outside facilitator. They got the stakeholders involved. They re-baselined because they had an unrealistic expectation of what this facility should cost. They got approval from their corporate board, and they completed it under budget and ahead of schedule because they were able to accelerate. So when you kind of look at these things, and again, looking at them from 1,200 plus projects, you start to see the same things over and over again. And that's what happens when you do research. And as I said, I've been very fortunate to be able to look at this entire process over a long period of time, really thematically. And so I like the word paradigm. You may have heard this paradigm word before. Sometimes we can get locked into paradigms. But as I've gone through this, and as my teams have gone through this, and kudos to a lot of grad students and a lot of great industry partners doing this, you start to see patterns. And you start to see practices within this discipline that can lead to success. So that's where I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking to you today as we go through this. So first place is at a high level, I'd really like to talk to you about 3 big ideas. And these 3 big ideas encompass a lot of things, but they also focus on the 3 big ideas I think that are very important as we talk about developing a capital project in the front-end plan. So the first one, I made them into big letters, big words, so you can see them. It's kind of Burma shave, right? You know, wall drugs 25 miles ahead. But the first one is, during this front-end planning process, we have to make sure that we're building the right project for the organization. How many of you have built the wrong project for your organization? Anybody? You can raise your hand. I know you have. You know, does it meet the strategic intent? Do we have alignment of the stakeholders? Do we know what we're going to get at the very end? And then judge ourselves versus that. This is hard. All of these things are hard. But the big idea is that if we don't really understand what we're doing in terms of what the right project is, we can do a great job of scoping the wrong project and executing the wrong project. And early in my career, when I was on the construction side, I built the wrong project. And I know it, and it still haunts me today, 40 years later, 35 years later. Something that stays with you. So you build the right project, but you have to plan that up front. What are we doing? Let's get the right thing in place. The second thing you got to do is scope the right things during that planning process. We're not going to design everything, but there's certain things that we need to scope. So here in DOE, we need to understand our technology, we need to understand our equipment. If it's on the process side, we need to know the P&IDs, heat material balances, all those kinds of process engineering things. If it's a building, we need to know the functional uses and how the facility is going to work with people. If it's an infrastructure project, we need to know how the capacity is going to meet our demand and so on and so forth. Certain things we have to do. I heard earlier a couple of presentations, definitely need to do geotechnical investigations before we get into the design phase. We need to do environmental investigations before we get into the design phase. That's up front. Sometimes we have to do pilot projects during the front-end planning process. It's scoping the right things and making sure that we pick the right alternatives up front so that now we can go do what we really want to do. We can build the right project. And we can do it with some certainty around cost as we go through. The third big idea is, and one that many times is kind of glossed over, is during that front-end planning process, we really need to start thinking about how we're going to deliver that process in that facility. Who's going to do the design? How are we going to procure construction? How are we going to procure long lead equipment? How are we going to do materials management? Do we have access to actually do the construction? Do we have a good cost estimate that's been independently verified? Heard that already today. Do we have a schedule? Do we understand the probability around that schedule? Those are the things that we need to do in that front-end planning phase. So if you do those 3 things, big ideas, do the right project, make sure that we're doing the right project, make sure that we're scoping the right things during the planning process, making sure that we're setting the stage for successful execution. It's just easy, easy, easy. These are hard, though, and we all know that. We've been there as we've gone through this process. How much does it cost to do an effective job of front-end planning? To that 30% design complete phase, we've looked at a lot of projects over the years. And what I would say is there's kind of a rule of thumb, a heuristic, but it depends a lot on the project itself. Anywhere from 1.5% to 5% of your baseline project cost. For larger projects, it might be a little less than the 5% because of the size of the projects. But for very, very complicated projects, it could be a good bit more than 5%. So it does take resources to do an effective job of front-end planning. Because you've got to figure out what we're doing, what makes it up, and how we're going to do it. And that takes engineering hours, that takes professional project management hours to do that. So here are the 9 rules of the game. I gave you the 3 big ideas. I'm going to give you the 9 rules of the game. I got that little photo. I thought that was kind of cute. So, 9 rules of the game, the paradigms that we've identified over the years. Number one, we've got to have a defined front-end planning process, but we've got to stick to it and use it. And it needs to have enough detail so that we understand what it takes to get through that process. Secondly, we found that using tools, whether they're the project definition rating index or checklists, as we've heard before, or independent risk assessments or external independent reviews, all of these are tools for the toolbox, the arrow in your quiver, so to speak, but they get you on the right trail. They allow you to understand where your gaps are. We found that to be very important. No one of us probably has enough experience in planning for every project. And so having those things available helps us do a better job. Third, and as long as I can consult, I'll always be able to consult because people have a tendency not to look at their existing conditions. It's amazing to me. We don't want to spend money to go out and check out the soils and the environmental conditions and understand the permitting requirements and understanding local regulatory requirements. We just don't want to do that up front, but if you don't, it's at your peril. So that's one of the rules of the game. Any rule here you break, you're going to pay the price. Fourth thing is understanding that contracting strategy matters. Contracting strategy should be tied to the project and why we're doing it and how we're going to do it. Not, we're just going to use the same method on every project, kind of rote. Just doesn't work that way. Number 5, don't underestimate team and organizational alignment. The previous presenter talked all about this, how it's so important to get the right people involved in your project and align them toward the project. That's the quickest way to derail your project. Number 6 is a cautionary tale. What we found was that project teams can be very successful on some kinds of projects, and then suddenly they get into unfamiliar territory and they get cocky. And they decide, well, we can do just what we did before. You know, it doesn't matter that it's a new project type or new technology or new location. We can just do what we've done before and we just slog through it. No, it means that you need to do more. It's just important from that perspective. Team building is extremely important as well. I go in and consult sometimes on projects. It's amazing how many times I've been in talking to a project team on a project in the front end, and it's the first time I've ever met the team. It's the first time the team's ever met the team. Right? Let's ignore this team building thing, and it never works. You've got to build a team. You've got to build empathy. You've got to build it out that way. You've got to have experienced and capable personnel. I know that's kind of a motherhood and apple pie thing as well, but the reality of it is you have to have experienced, capable personnel, especially in key disciplines for the project. So if your project is a building, you need to have a capable and experienced architect. If it's a science project with physics, you have to have capable and experienced physicists. You have to have those people engaged in the front-end plan. Otherwise, you're going to have big problems later on. Finally, the biggest rule of all is leadership. Amazing. I mean, she came in and immediately took a leadership role in that project in San Francisco. And you see that, and I would almost guarantee you, if you've looked at projects over a long period of time, you can tell the ones that had good leadership and who got in there. You also can tell the ones probably that had good leadership above the team. And good leadership not only on the owner's side, but also on the contractor side. In a vacuum like that in front-end planning, you're going to have difficulties. Almost in every case in failures that we've looked at from a front-end planning perspective over the past 26 years, we found out that leadership was one of those things that became a problem. Many times there's no leader. You know, no one wants to appoint a leader in the front end. We're just going to kind of do this by committee. Doesn't work, right? As you go through it. So how do we improve? Well, follow the rules. Understand the big ideas, but over the years, that wasn't enough. So I've had the privilege of being involved with CII and others trying to develop some tools and techniques to try to help with this. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we've developed a suite of management tools that help inform decisions. An HTML-based system. We've looked at the entire front-end planning process across all the sectors. We've looked at alignment. We've looked at renovation, revamp projects. We've looked at shutdown turnarounds from a planning perspective. We've developed tools for buildings, industrial, infrastructure projects. We developed tools for small infrastructure projects, small industrial projects. You can kind of see the cost range and those kind of things. And the whole intent and purpose of this was to have tools so that people can kind of understand where we're going. Because we lose a lot of experience, and we're losing more experience in our industry through the baby boom generation leaving. So what does it take to put together a good project? I would also tell you that none of these tools do any planning whatsoever. Planning is hard work. You have to do the planning. They help you assess and look at what needs to go into the planning. All right, so let me talk real quickly about the 5 PDRI tools. It's a suite of tools that we have developed. Input into those tools to actually develop those tools, over 6,000 years of experience in planning. It's a pretty amazing number when you start looking at that. And so the way we've developed it has been to grab industry and commercial practice and bring it in and understand what's important and what isn't important in the front-end planning process. Here's an example. This is a weighted score sheet from the PDRI for industrial projects. Some of you may have seen this. This is the commercial version of the PDRI. Just to give you an example, Section 1, Project Basis of Decision, you'll see there's one category, manufacturing objectives criteria. You'll see there are 3 different elements that make that up. Those are 3 elements that must be addressed during the front-end planning process. There's a scoring mechanism. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And so the project team looks at that, and they look at the description of element A2. So, see if I can make this work. They look at the description of element A2, maintenance philosophy. Here's the description of maintenance philosophy. They evaluate it, usually with an outside facilitator, determine whether they've developed a maintenance philosophy for the facility at hand. And if they haven't, they have gaps, and there's a consensus scoring that goes into it. Pretty simple. Provides good value for the project team, and it gives you an understanding of what should be expected to put together for an industrial type facility. There are ways to evaluate it, from well-defined, which is 1, to poorly defined. This is the golf score mentality. Lower score is better in this particular golf score. And as you can see, from complete definition all the way to incomplete or poorly defined. And so a facilitator helps the project team determine how they're doing versus, in this case, maintenance philosophy. And in this case, maybe we say that we were definition level 3. We had some deficiencies we need to work before we move through our gate 3 process. Let me see if I can sink the putt here. I usually do. I've never missed it. There we go. So lower scores better in golf. Lower scores better in PDRI. And in PDRI, usually the par score on the course is around 200 or around 300, but it's a way of trying to figure out where things are. Now the score, a lot of people focus on the score of PDRI, and what I would tell you is that is absolutely not the thing to focus on. It's the process of getting there, because if we bring an integrated project team together and we do an assessment, just like if you had an external independent review and you had the project team in the room, they're going to learn things about the project that they can help improve upon. And so it's the gap list and what we're trying to find as we go through that. All right, so this is can you read that bottom line down there? Probably not. This is actually the output from a compression facility I facilitated for a private owner down in South Texas. And these are the results of some of the things that came out of that session. So we looked at reliability philosophies. We rated it a definition level of 3. It had a score of 9 points that came out of that. And you can see there's some issues that we had gaps on and some things that we knew. You know, the same thing with A2, A3, D5, and so on and so forth. it's a pretty good assessment of a project. As I said, this was a compression facility for natural gas. Did this a couple of years ago, I think, about 3 years ago down in Texas. So, wait a minute here, Mr. Crumley. Maybe it isn't kidney stones after all. How many of you have been on projects where people just wave their hands around and they're like, well, I know what the problem is, I know what the problem is, and they were totally wrong? Ever happened to you? And so what we're trying to do is, over the time with building these tools, is develop an opportunity to figure out really what the issue is as we go through that process. So it's pretty interesting. Hopefully I woke you up a little bit there. If we go back and look at 413.3, what you'll see is the PDRI probably is best used from initiation approaching CD2 up to about 30% of the design effort complete. So it actually can help. And what we found is it's best used with an independent project team, facilitated with a focus on where are the gaps and where do I need to improve my process. And it's been battle tested with billions of dollars worth of projects, and it has input from thousands of years of experience. So it's a nice tool, something that you can use tomorrow. It's on your tool belt. One other study we're doing right now is looking at a maturity and accuracy of feed being front-end engineering design. This chart's never been shown anywhere before because it's not finalized, but we plotted cost performance versus two indexes. One is maturity score on the y-index. One is accuracy score on the x-index. I think there are 31 projects, about $8 billion worth of capital projects here. And we were looking at factors that influence both maturity of feed and accuracy of feed. And I guess kind of at the end of it, it looks like this. If you're at low maturity, low accuracy, at the end of front-end planning, on average, those projects were 22% above budget. It means that we haven't done very much. But those projects were authorized and proceeded. If you're high maturity, low accuracy, and I'll talk about what that means in just a moment, you were 7% above budget. Better, 15% better in terms of average and statistically significant. If we're at high accuracy, high maturity, we're 2% below budget. So this is another $9 billion worth of projects that wasn't in the stuff I talked about earlier. So what are the top 20% industrial project maturity elements? They're listed here. We have to understand these kinds of things. All of these, actually, the PDRI elements there and the descriptions have been developed. So it gives us an idea of where we need to focus from a maturity perspective. The accuracy thing's a little trickier. There are 27 elements that make that up. Here are the top 5, top 20%. I'll let you read through these, but how many of you have been on projects where some or all of these are missing? Yeah. And what we found is there's a real detriment when that happens. This is the environment that the project is in while it's putting together the front-end engineering design. So we continue to find this stuff over time. To me, it's kind of the same message like Bill Murray and Groundhog Day. You know, kind of I'm hearing the same things, but we learn a little bit more as we go through this, and I think it's important to continue to reflect on things that have changed and things that are the same. So I'll bring us back around to the paradigm slide again and kind of wrap this thing up. I've got a few minutes to do that. So how many of you have heard this? Yeah, I have too. That's wrong. That's very wrong. And the result really is bad careers and bad projects and broken careers. I continue to hear this. You talk to people, well, my project's different. We can't employ this stuff. We can't use this. We don't need to do front-end planning. We've done this project before. I know what I'm doing. And that's just wrong. It's just wrong. Today, what I would say, and what you hear as you go around the industry commercially, and I hear it here at DOE, is that front-end planning processes are critical. And I heard it this morning in some of the presentations. but it's all about people and execution. And I think that's where we are today. We know how to do projects. We know how to plan projects and so on and so forth. We've got to execute them. Owners, designers, contractors need to foster those skill sets and capabilities because we all add value to that process. So, riding off into the sunset here, we know why to do front-end planning. We've seen the results. All of you have. We know what to do. We've got the order. We've got all this documentation that's put out there. Doesn't make it easier. It just says we know what to do. We know when to do it. We know how to do it. And so I'm here to talk to you about that process. And what we're doing here at DOE, we're actually taking a look at the guide on PDRI, and we're updating it based on best commercial practice. And we're hoping to have that done in September. We're going to have a certified PDRI facilitators training session up here at DOE in early June. We're going to develop a front-end planning process with PDRI for FPDs and IPTs and evaluate whether to include that into PMCDP. We're hoping to have that rolled out in the fall. And then we'll be presenting the final products to a number of folks across DOE. Also, as mentioned earlier, I'm on the Project Leadership Institute board, and we're actually presenting some of this material to the cohort making up that PLI in May at a conference or at a session in Boulder. So trying to put some of this stuff together, understanding of commercial best practices and how to make this happen. So one of my favorite philosophers is Yogi Berra, or was Yogi Berra. So when you come to a fork in the road, you take it. Well, you hope you take the right fork, right? And so as we kind of talk through here, I think you maybe know where my passions lie. The right fork is to do the right things up front to be successful as we go. So I'll be around through the social this afternoon. I think I've got about 4 minutes for Q&A if anybody has a question. Wow, must have been 58 slides in 41 minutes. That's pretty good. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so you started out by saying that our 413 guide on PDRI is not up to date, not aligned.
Right.
Got it. I agree with you. Why? What's the problem with the current guide, and so where's the major disconnect, and what do we need to sort of fix in that whole process?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 or 3 things. I think the guidance on how to use the tool, I mean, the guide itself focuses on the score almost without fail. I mean, the score is a good thing, but if I had to, and I'm the developer of the PDRI, if I had to tell you, the score is a good indicator of where you are, but it's the process of getting there and how you employ it. So that's one piece. There are some homegrown PDRIs that have flipped the scale and they go from 0 to 100. And you know, looking at those, I'm not really sure necessarily how valuable and valid some of those scoring mechanisms are. At the time that guide was developed, there weren't these, I think there were only 2 PDRIs that were available. Now there are 5. So we're going to write in the tools that are available, how to use them, what to use at the right time, and those kinds of things. So we're going to make sure that it's pretty indicative of what's out there commercially available. So it's an excellent question. Thank you.
All right, any more questions?
I got 2 minutes.
Great. All right, thank you very much, Dr. Gibson.
Thank you.